All right. It looks like we're live. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes to have a couple of other folks join before we get started. All right. I think it's 1 minute after the hour, so it's probably a fair time for us to get started. So we're here with Thea Mannix, who kindly agreed to join us on the podcast and this live recording format that we do with the podcast. So Thea is half scientist, half techie, uh, a co-founder of a cool company called Praxis Labs. We'll talk about that, and we're going to talk all about metrics in security measurement and the human element as that pertains to measurement or as measurement pertains to it. So just a couple things for those of you that are on, really appreciate you joining. And, these aren't usually like we don't have a ton of people on with us, but those that are very welcome to chime in. You can use the chat feature or the question Q&A feature, whichever one, to put in comments, questions, thoughts, and I usually do a pretty good job of keeping an eye on that and um, involving you in the conversation. So, and that's part of the benefit of doing this live. So, Thea, thank you for taking the time for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us maybe a bit about your background before Praxis, how you came to be where you are today.
Oh, sure. So I'm actually not from cybersecurity at all, or a particularly technical background. I started in psychology, and then I started a PhD in neuroscience. And as I was coming out at the end of that, I was running out of funding and was looking for a research assistant position and ended up in a cybersecurity research lab. And then sort of realized that we could probably do with some psychologists in cybersecurity. And so, yeah, that's really how I ended up here. Worked for security awareness training companies prior to founding our business, Praxis Security Labs, which I'm working with today as the research director and co-founder.
Mm. Well, yeah, certainly there are a lot of people in tech who don't have, or in security even, who don't have a security background per se, and you kind of develop that as we go along. I think it's pulling a lot of people in. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and certainly psychology. You're right. I think we're starting to see much more of a need for that um, as we unpack the kind of human centric elements of security. Um, so, what tell us maybe a bit more about Praxis Labs and what kind of motivated you to do that? Um,
Yeah, so we kind of got together and we did some consulting with kind of on the ground with companies that were looking to kind of improve their security or general human factors in security. And we discovered that one of the leading issues that we have is that it's hard to measure, number one, whether any interventions you're making are actually working. And number two, just keeping a track of human behavior because it's a very specialist type of measurement and they don't really have access to that. And kind of the realization that a lot of human behavior data is actually sitting in people's computer systems as their log files. Um, and that what we could do is take that data, come up with some metrics that we know are actually predictive of human behavior, and combine those in such a way that people can access that level of expertise without necessarily having to hire a neuroscientist and a statistician and some other kind of expert. So that was really the drive behind the business. So Practice Security Labs, we have a SaaS product that essentially takes all data from lots of different disparate sources, puts it together, contextualizes it, and then prioritizes things that may or may not need to be addressed. And then what we also do is we track those changes over time using clear, meaningful metrics based on that data. So yeah.
Nice. Well,
Mhm.
right up our alley. It's good that we're talking. So it's, I guess, safe to say that the measurements that you guys are focused on are in the human kind of element,
Yes.
human factors. Okay.
Mm.
Um, so what actually, I mean, this I had like a little list of points, but this is going to be probably the first deep dive into one of these topics that you were bringing up. Um, what do you see as some of the biggest, I guess maybe I should say, what are the biggest successes that you've had with using these kinds of metrics? Maybe an anecdote or something that highlights that.
Um, yes, so I do have a couple of those. My favorite thing is that when we get hold of data and we start using these metrics, and you find that something that people have been trying to implement for the last several years is not having an impact,
Mhm.
and they discover that what they've actually been putting money and resources into isn't actually working, and then being able to kind of readjust those resources to something that maybe is working or actually addressing a problem. Um, for example, we had there's a company who had they're a multinational company, and they found that in a particular area of the company, people were failing their phishing simulations very, very consistently. And they had assumed that this was because of a language barrier, because it was a multinational corporation, for example. And so they were spending a lot of money and time in translating the training that they were giving them into their local language in order to try and improve this issue.
Were they
Um,
doing it themselves? They were
they were doing their own
actually
internal
doing their
training. Yeah.
own. Wow. Okay.
They were
Mhm.
they were producing internal training. And then obviously, actually translating training videos is a huge, huge task. It's very
Mhm.
expensive, it's very time consuming, particularly if you're trying to do it with internal resources and you're not using a vendor. But they were doing this, and we've discovered using our metrics that the reason that wasn't necessarily because of the language. In fact, it couldn't be the language because number one, the working language of the company was English anyway. And number two, 80% of the employees that were employed there were also English native speakers. Simply because they were in an office that was in another country, they assumed it was a linguistic problem. So they've just translated all of this training into a local language that 80% of that population don't speak naturally as a
Oh,
first
that's funny. So it actually went against the grain, or
Yes, so it went against it, but they identified the problem, which is great, but they identified a bad cause of the problem. I thought the cause of the problem was made on an assumption, and a very reasonable assumption.
yeah.
That's a very reasonable assumption. Um, so then we're able to discover it wasn't that. And when we found out that we had very low local management engagement in that particular region. So your immediate management were not particularly fond of the cybersecurity implementations that were going on. They were actually getting quite frustrated with them. And we were like, well, maybe you can address that issue. Because especially if your boss doesn't care about it, generally speaking, you won't care about it. This is one of the core findings actually in psychology and cybersecurity. So yeah, so we'll see how that goes. I don't know what the outcome of that is yet. These things take time. But at least we've managed to kind of address a problem at a core cause of a problem that we knew was actually there, and not making assumptions about why people are behaving a certain way. This is the point of being data driven. And I hear that all the time, particularly when people talk about psychology. Well, that's obvious. It's like, yes, a lot of these things can be obvious, but they're not necessarily. Actually, people are very unpredictable and they're very complex. So you don't necessarily go with the most obvious answer.
Yeah. Well, and hindsight, as we say, is always 2020. So
Mm.
Yeah, it becomes obvious once you figure it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 It's like, oh yeah. um, so that's interesting. Who do you find when it comes to kind of human behavioral metrics within an organization? Who do you find are the most likely types of people that can actually look at these metrics and interpret them and
Mm.
find you know make them useful? It's not the
Well,
CISO, I guess, is it? Or sorry.
I think it's difficult. A lot of cybersecurity teams, and of course, my just to point this out, my sample size is very small because we know what we have from either consulting or our design partners. We haven't
Mhm.
quite launched the product yet, so it's
Okay,
this is just from. So I have a pilot sample, shall we say?
understood.
Um, yeah. So I think security teams often, I think the person who's got the most technical capability often ends up with. Dealing with sorting data and figuring out metrics for human risk factors. And this is not really so problematic in the sense that they're unable to do it, but it's problematic in the sense that those people tend to be very overloaded with work anyway. They tend to get borrowed by different departments. They tend to get landed with a lot of things. So I think even though, on the surface that looks like a good idea, because they're probably able to manage the spreadsheets and the calls and the data organization. That's really grunt work that you probably shouldn't be giving to someone who's quite core to your other cybersecurity tasks. Um,
Hmm.
so it can seem intimidating, but a lot of this isn't. And of course, tools like ours exist. I know that there are other tools out there that exist that will do that grunt work for you. And actually, the people that then should be using it are the people that are in charge of cybersecurity. So CISOs, you're looking also maybe involving human resources a little bit in that process as well, to kind of to get rid of those organizational silos. And also, I would like to point this out as well. Human resources have a lot of insight into behavior, into the organizational culture, into if whether people are going to respond positively or negatively to certain types of communication, because that's really primarily their job. And so I would definitely also suggest that you at least partially involve someone from that department as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that one of my other kind of side jobs with OutThink is to run the Cybersecurity Human Risk Management Forum, CHRM Forum, and we have these meetings actually with practitioners. So far, it's been physical, New York, London. We're going to start doing it more virtual, like on Zoom, so that we can include more people that are not in New York and London. Amazing that there are actually people that
That's
don't
incredible.
live in those two cities. But anyway, but one of the common things that comes out in these conversations is that the security team feels like they're on an island when dealing with like human issues. And it's like all about human resource. Like HR is clearly should be a stakeholder, shouldn't they? Um,
110%.
and then there's the business. They should be a stakeholder too, the board. I mean, it's kind of an issue.
I think metrics provide a really interesting way of trying to engage stakeholders, actually, because you can,
Mm,
friction is a cost. Friction costs you money because it costs you time, right? Your people are not at work doing what you're paying them to do. They're doing extra, what they consider to be extra things, which is the cybersecurity side of things, right? Um, and getting people frustrated or that also can affect their ability to do their work if they're having negative feelings towards the organization, for example, because your training is long and horrible and they have to sit there and they're spoken to like they're stupid, for example, if you've got really poor training. They're not exactly, it's not building a relationship with the company. But you can have metrics like business costs. You actually calculate that friction.
mm,
What's there? You can calculate some business costs. You can also look at, especially if you're looking at security culture, organizational culture is the basis of whatever security culture. It will have to operate within that. And the
yes.
people that know the organizational culture are human resources. So, get some human resource metrics as well and see how they interact with your cybersecurity metrics. Because at least then, even if that's not the main point of what you're trying to talk about, what you've done is you've said, we need your expertise, and you're demonstrating that to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're at least you're not pushing that department away. You're
Mm.
involving them. Yeah, you're kind of being more inclusive about the problem. I'm not an HR specialist, but I wonder what metrics, like the HR leadership, what's their metrics dashboard? Um, it's probably a lot about recruiting, but I don't know.
It is.
Anyway,
I mean, more and more now they're doing something called sentiment analysis,
oh
which
yeah.
is looking at the kind of language that's used for communication within the company, which can
Mm,
tell you a lot about people's attitudes and people's feelings about different things, depending on what kind of words they use.
yes.
Uh, which is really, I think that's really cool. I love that.
That is kind of cool. Having had some direct experience with natural language processing myself, sentiment analysis can go both ways. But
Mm, mm.
the machines are smart, but not that smart yet to figure it out. But
Can't interpret it. No.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
it's easy to construct a phrase that hides sarcasm that the machines won't pick up on. But
Yeah.
but eventually, that's a good point actually. Just in terms of metrics, just to come back to that, um, what do you feel are the kind of key metrics? Like, what's the most important metrics to look at in terms of the human centric layer of security?
I mean, you've got your classic boring, I'm sorry, but compliance metrics. That is, it's
Yeah.
important. You have to have that in there. The problem is people make compliance metrics the be all and end all of all existence, and that it's not actually interpreting much other than ticking a box. I
Agreed.
think also we have like engagement metrics, so how people are engaging with cybersecurity and how they're treating cybersecurity. And people often say, well, that's very fluffy, but you can come up with your own. You have to decide what data you have available in order to develop what metrics you can
Mhm.
measure
Yes.
um, as well. I also think, if I'm looking into the future and it's certainly coming from my background, one of the main issues with measuring humans is they are so unpredictable. That being said, in some ways they're extremely predictable, particularly neurologically. We know how long
Mm.
it takes you to read something. For example, we know how long it takes you to pay attention to something. We know that you need new information, sensory information, in order to pay attention to something. So I'm just always wondering about whether we can try and utilize that a little bit to generate some metrics. So just to give you, and I'm sorry, I'm going off with this now, Leb, but just to give you an
Yeah.
example, in order to finish reading something, it actually takes 800 milliseconds. It's close to a full second to actually
Okay.
engage all of the processes needed to understand what you've read. The problem is we finish seeing it after about 250 milliseconds and we think we're done with it because you've finished seeing it. The visual aspect of processing words has finished, but the meaning aspect takes a long time. It's a very complex brain process.
Mm.
So what you can guarantee is that if somebody's opened an email, for example, and they've clicked on a link in under 500 milliseconds, they haven't read it properly.
Okay. I see what you mean.
You
Yeah.
see what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can have these kind of impulsive clicking measurements. That would be a really great metric to see if people are actually focusing or paying attention. And then from those kind of metrics, we can look at things like what time of day are people most vulnerable to not paying attention? When do we need to actually hone in on giving them additional support in making sure that they are careful and kind of implementing whatever training you've given them?
Hmm.
Really, the sky's the limit in terms of metrics. I think what is important as well is really going to depend on your industry, and it's really going to depend on your specific organizational needs as well. And I feel like security professionals often look at vendors going, okay, tell me what to do. And in fact, the person that knows best what to do is the person that's in charge of security at that organization. You have the knowledge. Vendors are there to give you the supporting tools to implement the knowledge that you have.
For
Um,
sure.
and I don't like the industry's kind of undermined them quite a lot over the last, I think, probably the last sort of 15 years. But realistically, you know, that's really who's got the knowledge and understanding enough to decide what metrics are important for us.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and vendors are kind of in a different position. I think you're right. I think the stakeholder within the company, they know best, like what the company's trying to do, what their risk appetite is, what, you know, like what they're willing to undertake, or what their even business objectives are. But you know, as a vendor, I guess you see a few, like you specialize in one little niche of security or whatever it is, and you see a lot of implementations of that niche. So you do have some very specific expertise that you can
Absolutely.
bring.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the internal stakeholders, they need to know like what expertise they should get from the vendor and what they can't.
Exactly. It's about leveraging that.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. It's about them leveraging um, expertise that they don't maybe have internally. And that's really
yeah.
mm.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Um, somebody, so we have an anonymous person here. They didn't identify their name, but they put in a question. I'm having trouble a little bit interpreting it, but I'm just going to read it out. Maybe you can help me, Thea. um, what do you think is the biggest leak or mistake made by human behavior? Is human error a bigger issue, or is it software that leads to more of these leaks? I guess by leaks, it's probably suggesting some sort of something about leaking, like
Breach,
data leaks or
breaches.
breaching data, maybe. Leak to me suggests that they're thinking about data,
Mm.
at least.
Uh,
That's
hmm.
what I'm interpreting.
I think I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there's a bit of a chicken and the egg answer to that because the person who's invented technology to protect us was a person. So
Mhm.
where do you stop with the human error, you know?
You know, it's interesting. Our talking to one of our CISO advisors, who's like the CISO at Microsoft Gaming or something, and he was saying, you know, like a lot of people, exactly to your point, Thea, like a lot of people misinterpret the DBIR, the Verizon report,
Mhm.
because like in that percentage, I think the latest statistic is 68%, but it's been as high as like 80 or um, there's a lot of that like software development error kind of built into that. So it's not all clicking on phishing links, human error. There's the human error that's kind of delivered as part of the product
Mhm.
in that report as well, to your point. So absolutely. Where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line? Ultimately, human error is responsible for probably 100% of it if you keep going back far enough. But like, you know, you've got to draw a line somewhere and decide and find what you're actually talking about when you say human error.
It's
Um,
an elegant response to this question, actually.
yeah.
It's kind of mathematically elegant, but yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and yeah, it's actually hard. I mean, you have to go back through like the incident statistics to see what the percentage is. One of the other percentages that I've seen is something around also 90%. I don't remember the exact statistic of attacks start with phishing. So like a
Mm.
really high percentage of attacks start with phishing, which I guess is why everybody is so focused on phishing.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you can't ignore that that statistic. I think that's been one of those that's been very common. I mean, you either see findings, people either say something around 72 to 95%, depending on sort of what kind of restrictions they put on classing it as a phishing attempt, for example.
Hmm.
I think it's just business email compromise overall, which is not necessarily phishing. It's probably actually a slightly
Sure.
higher percentage. So I don't know if people are separating those.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
true. It's easy to mix phishing, business email compromise, social engineering, and when you start measuring those, like where are the overlaps? Um,
Mm.
yeah, it's which actually leads me to another topic. And thank you, by the way, anonymous person, for throwing that in. And feel free to clarify if you want to in the Q&A, or add follow-up questions. The other topic that we discussed before is this kind of the tension between academia and um, technology implementation, let's say, or business, maybe the business world, the academic world. And, and I think you and I both we geeked out a little bit talking about how we both have had some experience dealing with that. And when you talk about, like, well, it depends how you categorize human error or how you categorize phishing versus BEC, it reminds me of conversations that I have with academics who also focus a lot on categorization of data, so that to make sure that we're all on the same page, I guess, um, and talking about the same thing. What are some of the challenges that you see in, like the business world, academic world, kind of being able to speak the same language and collaborate?
Mm. Absolutely. I think one of the issues that I see is that um, the business side of things are they tend to stick with one definition of something, and even if it's not a perfect definition. So, for example, human error is something that, as an academic, really irritates me when I hear that, because I'm like, well, actually, it's not. They didn't make a mistake. So for example, if you've got somebody who is a salesperson and their job is to open attachments and click on links, and they've done that action again, it's not necessarily they've made an error. I actually would put the blame on some sort of technology that's even allowed it to get to that point. I think the one thing, the fact that the phishing statistic has remained largely unchanged for
Hmm.
X number of years now tells us it's not people being stupid, it's people operating within the restrictions of what they're capable of doing at any one time. If we were
Yeah.
able to, we need technology in place to support people in not taking a wrong action on an email, for example. Um, and you need the training, but you also need the technology. So I would blame technology in that. So I've got a bit of a tandem on that. But and you
I
can
would
get to
agree.
a conversation with an academic at an industry conference, and they will spend an hour disseminating what is meant by human error and why you should actually use a separate terminology for that. We should call it, I don't know, human negative behavior or something like that. They'll come up with some sort of terminology. They don't actually like to get to the core of a problem, because they're kind of theorizing and so interested in making sure that the language that we use is so important in order to describe what we're talking about. So they're almost like at the too high level of specificity about this kind of stuff, right? And they're never actually attacking the core issue. Should we, what word should we use to describe this? Okay, but in business is like, it's human error. This is what we're talking about. They're actually talking about changing it, and not necessarily spending 4 hours getting into a theoretical discussion about how to define it,
Hmm.
because they
Yeah.
use it. They are here defining it, and they're actually using it. So
Perfection is the enemy.
exactly, yeah, precisely. And I think there needs to be some midway where both of them probably need to take a few steps in, um, to each other's space in
Yeah.
terms of
Yeah. No, absolutely. That resonates very much with what I've seen as well. It's the academic approach might be correct, but by the time it gets there, it misses the point or something like that. I don't
yeah.
know.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a perfect description of it, actually. Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah. Well, the same on both sides of the pond, I guess. So, Mr. Anonymous, or maybe another anonymous person, I don't know if you can read these, Thea, but at the convergence, I guess, between two very different industries, neuroscience and cybersecurity. What has been the most surprising findings thus far from your research? That's a very broad question.
Wow. Or she's gonna have to give me a second to think about it.
Not
From my own research, so from my own published research within cybersecurity, we did actually do a really epic year-long experiment on whether targeted training was better than just kind of handing out training willy-nilly to people. So where you found out what was wrong with them, what was wrong, what was the core of the problem, you train them specifically on that problem. And then for the rest of the organization, we just gave them random training throughout the year. And what we found was that if you target training, they will improve on every measure. So not even on the specific issue that they had, but on every measure that we had. And if you randomly assign training, they actually got worse. They
worse by
actually
what
got
metric?
worse at
Like
reassessment.
the engagement, the
It,
knowledge, or
yeah, we did engagement, knowledge, attitudes,
oh my.
and the actual behavior as
So you're
well.
kind of pissing them off
You've
or
pissed them
something.
off to the point where they're now sabotaging that
No.
actually happened, and or they're just not engaged, they're not paying attention anymore. But if you just provided them, they had the same amount of training at the same time. It wasn't that we were giving more or less to anybody, but if you target that training, they will improve on multiple metrics
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
by changing that one thing. And I think that was a really good sign for me, because as well as a neuroscientist, I'm always saying you can affect behavior. You can, people have knock-on effects. They're not computers. You don't just do one thing and it does one thing. You do one thing and it does 100. It has a huge, huge impact. Um,
Yeah.
so I thought that was yeah, probably from my own research.
What a brilliant response to like this random question that's kind of broad, but that's super interesting. And one of the things that it kind of harkens back to our prior discussion a few minutes ago, that it's obvious, of course, but once you measure it, then you really understand it, and then you can, because yeah, it's hypothetically obvious, but empirically, that's when you can really put a stamp on it.
And you can actually, do something with it. And I think that's what's so
Yeah.
great as well about OutThink, because it's a data-driven system. So you are,
Yeah.
you know,
Very much aligned with that thinking.
mm,
Absolutely. Um, that's so cool. What um what are other, like, what are some of the ways we kind of started to talk about this when we talked about HR, but what are some other things that you've seen in terms of measuring security culture? Like, are there indicators or metrics that you guys look at, or that you think you should be looking at, that kind of give you an indication of, hey, this is a healthy security culture, this is not so healthy, or it's improving by 20% or whatever? Like, is it
mm.
possible to even measure the improvement in culture? What's your take on that?
My answer, but shockingly, is yes, as you might imagine. But
Yeah.
I think it goes back to I did a blog post a couple of weeks ago on measuring the unmeasurable. And I think we had a little bit of discussion about
I
that. And
saw
the
that.
idea
Yeah.
is that the problem with measuring security culture is that it's, I believe, a theoretical concept. We don't have a universal definition of what it is. And then people go, well, how can you measure it?
Mhm.
And my answer to that is always intelligence is a theoretical concept, but we still measure it, right? The measurement is aimed to estimate as close as we can to this theoretical concept that we have. It doesn't, we have to have some sort of definition in order to operate within this space, right? And a lot of the talks that I've been to, people have presented the issue of having 100 different definitions of security culture as a bad thing, as a negative thing, or we don't know what it is, why we've got 100 different definitions. I actually think this is a fantastic thing. What you need to come up with as a security professional is your definition of what security culture means based on the data that you have. you can come up with a working concept of security culture, and you can start from the bottom and say, start measuring those things. So you would be very hard pressed, for example, to find somebody who said that behavior was not a part of security culture.
I would agree.
You would be good. You would be
Yeah.
quite hard pressed to, secondly, to find somebody who said attitudes were not a part of security culture.
Mm.
That
Yes.
friction was not a part of security culture.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yes, so we can say, well, yes, I think that's definitely it. So I'm going to put that in the model. Yes, that one, I'm going to put that in the model. Yes, I'm going to put that in the model. And you build, it's almost like people are trying to climb the mountain, starting at the top of the mountain. You know, it doesn't really, we can't really do that. We have to start at the bottom and build our way
Mm.
up
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
this definition. And I think that people are qualified based on, if, provided we get some expert input on making their own working definition based on what they're actually measuring,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
what they think is contributing to that culture. Now you get to a point there where things start to get a little bit complicated because you have to weight different measurements depending on how important they are. Not everything is made equal. You've
Mm.
probably got to put them through some sort of reasonable statistical analysis to make sure you're not just getting nonsense. But those are things where, there are tools available in order to do that. That's the grunt work that you can type out to expert vendors, and then sort of build a definition from there for yourself. Some people like to get it all down to one number. You can,
Mm.
you can do that. You can convert that into a 1 to 100 ratio and come out with a risk score or whatever it is that you'd like to have. You can do that, or you can just sit there and take an overall look at all of your metrics and decide what the direction of your culture is based on those individual changes.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Parker score. This was like something that 15 years
Mm,
ago or whatever became a thing for
mm,
wine, where the guy boiled down each wine to one number on a scale of 1 to 100.
yeah.
And it's infuriated of course, the wine industry.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's, I mean, if you can judge wine quality by one number, then why not human culture?
Listen, everything is an estimation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you
Everything
have to
is
be able to operate, as you
You
said.
have to be able to operate. I too loathe getting anything down to one number, generally speaking, unless it's like speed or something very direct. I prefer to have something, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, and that's one of the things that we need to have kind of a meeting on this with the CHRM forum that I described before. But like one of the things that the forum like this can do is, at least at an industry level, start to define like what do we all agree should be ingredients to this kind of metric, right? And then as vendors, we can all go off and measure that, but and help people implement it. But I feel like it's kind of about time for industry to start agreeing on what some of these metrics should be. Because, like you said, you need that in order to be able to operate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it needs to be a collaboration, something like the forum, for example, is a fantastic place for that, where you've got kind of academics meeting with industry professionals, meeting with people on the ground, and people at
Yeah.
kind of the bottom of the totem pole, and being able to kind of get all those different perspectives and try and put those together. And absolutely, it's a very
Yeah.
worthy exercise for the industry to do, especially now, especially with human risk management coming now. And
Yeah.
people are, sometimes I see people talking about security awareness, and I think, naturally, I think you're talking about human risk management here.
Mm.
So we're not even sure what the difference is sometimes between those things. It's blurred lines.
Yeah. 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 No, and I saw like one of the kind of execs that we recently spoke to at MasterCard um, sarcastically post on LinkedIn that, oh, it's not security awareness now. Now we're calling it human risk management. So it's going to be better. It's like, well, okay, that's one way to look at it. But but yeah, it's obviously a lot more effort than just renaming. Um, so one of the other, so somebody threw in another question for us that I want to include. So, what's the best way to deal with security breaches or human training if it isn't as helpful as we think? I guess human training isn't as helpful as we think. How do you approach security when human behavior is so unmeasurable?
Oh,
Uh,
oh,
that's yeah. These are
I
like.
feel personally attacked, whoever this
I'm with you on that.
uh, oh,
But
um, human training isn't as helpful as we think it is. Well, it is. I'm not going against training. Training's
yeah,
fantastic. You need that
yeah,
100%.
yeah. I mean, if
Um,
you're not aware,
if
yeah,
if you're not, or you know, you can't know what you don't know. Do you know? I mean, knowledge, that
yeah,
knowledge transfer is very important. Engagement is very important. One of the ways that you engage is by having good training. Um, you know, and having
yeah,
training that people actually engage with and enjoy. So I think training is definitely helpful. Problem is it does have a limit that it will hit, right? You can't train people to never ever be a victim of a phishing attack, for
yeah,
example.
yeah,
Now you can get that down from 40 to 4% chance
yeah.
with training. It's probably worth it. It's in the same way that we'll say, well, we're not going to put seatbelts in cars because everyone's been trained to drive properly. You know, the
Oh
risk
yeah,
remains. We
yeah,
still want people to take a driving license. I mean, that's, I don't think, I think it is necessary,
yeah. No,
absolutely mandatory. Yeah.
the driving analogy is a very good one. I'm glad you bring that up because, like, just because you have licensed drivers doesn't mean that you don't have any accidents.
Mhm.
It's but you still, does that mean that people shouldn't have a driver's license
Driving
or
license. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so there was a second question there.
Um, how do you approach security when human behavior is so unmeasurable?
Human
Well,
behavior is highly measurable. Human behavior is unpredictable, I
that's a
think.
good point. Yes.
Um, but it's very measurable. And under certain circumstances can be predictable. And that's really one of the purposes as well of gathering the behavioral data. When you start seeing patterns of behavior based on certain triggers, then those are opportunities where we can go in and manipulate that behavior the next time. And that's really a lot about why we do metrics in the first place. It's to try and find those opportunities to tweak the environment to manipulate behavior in a positive way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So yeah, that's and one of the, I think one of the topics, and we didn't get a chance to discuss this much, is uh, kind of the human factors design around choice architecture. Like when you talk about influencing behavior, it makes me think about things like choice architecture, like what options do you put in front of a person when, and people will choose based on the options you give them, right? And
Yes. I mean, that's where that's the locus of control that you have over that is by giving them or limiting their options of what they're able to do.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And I think as well when you're building sometimes when I work with engineers or I have worked with engineers, um, they can find it very difficult because they have a certain skill set and a certain logic that allows them to be highly skilled at engineering, for example. Um, they think, what would be easiest for me in this situation, right? And often
right.
they're operating at a whole different level than everybody else, um, and there's no kind of assessment of what actually generally what would people do and what would be easiest for people in this situation.
Mm,
Um, it's what would be easiest for me as the person building this,
yeah,
thing that people are going to use. So that's also another area I think we could, as an industry, could really improve on, is actually not deciding for people what's easiest, but actually, asking them.
yeah, yeah. Researching that, or yeah. Um, but one of the things we exchanged about early on in our conversation over email was biases and psychological biases, and
Mm.
I guess that's one of the biases that you probably see is people designing systems, maybe not, kind of not understanding that they're introducing their own bias.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we
Um,
all, it's not a bad thing. We all operate like that. And we can't really escape it. I mean, if you could, I
right.
think you'd be a Buddha, you know. We all operate within the ego, you know, we can't do that. But kind of just recognizing that, I think even
Yeah.
it's often not really even acknowledged that that's an issue. A lot of friction comes from not assessing
Yeah.
usability, you know,
Yeah.
depending on who
We,
you're making it for.
and this, yeah, the conversation that I had with Beck McEwen like a
Mhm.
couple of weeks ago was all about that, about human factors and like how do you design human factors in by taking some of those biases out, and doing, yeah, just kind of designing around people.
Mm.
But that's a whole other topic. One of the other, so actually there's another question in here that I think is worth bringing up before we draw to a close. We're kind of coming up on time, but so Alex asks, have you done any research into any psychological impact to those that have been victim of a breach of personal data? And if so, do you see a positive influence on future behaviors? That's a question that a lot of us actually have. I'd be very curious on your point of view on that.
Mhm. I can't say I've never conducted research into this,
Mhm.
but I have read quite a bit of research about the psychological impact of breaches on personal. Now, there's a difference between if, for example, I, in a personal capacity, fall for a scam, for example, and if I do it through work. There's a kind of there is a difference in that psychological impact. And really, you can negate a lot of the psychological impact of being responsible for a phishing breach at work by how you manage that person after and how you support that person after a breach. So we know that, for example, they feel, they feel stupid. There's often a lot of shame. There's a lot of
Mm.
fear around that. You know, it's a really bad thing. But you are, ultimately, they're an employee of the company. So I would say as quickly as possible, instead of immediately saying to them, well, you need to go through more training, were you not listening? You're responsible for this now. This has cost the company X amount of money. You say, oh gosh, look, this can happen to anybody, and thank you so much for reporting it as quickly as possible. For example, praise any kind of positive behaviors they've done afterwards, resilience-based behaviors afterwards. Maybe bring them in for a chat. I mean, all of this seems like mollycoddling. I understand that, but actually, if you negate the negative emotional impact of a breach, you do find positive influence over future behaviors. You also find that person becomes an engagement tool. They'll often become somewhat of a security champion around the office if they've been praised and positively handled. They'd be like, oh, that happened to me. Oh guys, you need to
Really
watch
good
out for
point.
this. I had that, I've had that problem, or Beth brought me into the office and we had a big chat about it. And you can find that actually you can turn that much to your favor. Alternatively, they can feel ashamed and fearful and start being a bit nervous. They get nervous about opening emails and things, but only for a period of about 2 weeks afterwards, and then that drops off.
Okay.
Um, that does not last permanently.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Yeah,
um,
that's actually a really good point that somebody that has fallen victim to a phishing attack could, when treated correctly, could become a champion and kind of help others. Um,
Absolutely. I encourage people actually, if that does happen, see that as an opportunity
yeah,
to create a security champion.
and
And
this
then,
really a lot of this kind of harkens back to culture and company culture around security. Is the company culture to point fingers and blame or to support employees? Comes back to the conversation about HR. We actually, one of the things that OutThink measures is what we call a redemption metric. So in the phishing simulation, if somebody does click on a link, but then they realize that, oh, I fell for a phishing sim or whatever, a phishing test, they still report it. So if they click and they report right away, then we track that.
yeah,
And that's, I think these types of things like kind of the positive silver lining around uh, attacks is important for culture.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah,
And it is all about, I feel like human risk management is actually about resilience over
yeah,
almost over prevention, because we've got to the point now, we've peak prevented people. We've really, they've got down to these percentage numbers and they don't seem to get any lower. Well, now it's about resilience. When that does happen, that small percentage does happen.
yeah,
How do you
yeah,
make the most of that? And how do you make sure that you ride the wave?
yeah, yeah. What do you do to contain the blast radius and make sure that you use that as a way to prevent future incidents?
Mm.
Um, Well, I think that's a great point on which we should probably conclude, since we scheduled for maybe 5 minutes over what we scheduled, but I see people are still on for the most part. So thank you. We've gotten through about 2/3 of my bullet points, so
Yeah,
perhaps
pretty
another
good.
conversation in the future. But yeah, thank you so much, Thea, for taking some time to talk about your research.
Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great.
Likewise. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank
We're going to have a
you.
recording out. Of course, it's a podcast. So come visit the podcast page. Engage and Secure is the name of the podcast. And we'll send out a follow up. So,
Perfect.
all right. Take care. Thank you.